I used to play rugby back in 2010, 2012-ish, and I loved the sport. Rugby was a huge passion of mine. It was the way that I actually got to know Chris, was through rugby, and it was in that sport that I learned a lot of things about injuries and getting injured, because when there's 280 tackles every game, you're going to get hurt. And specifically in one game, I was trying to jump for some reason. And when you're a bigger prop, or what's known as a lineman, like was what we'd probably consider him, you shouldn't do that. But I decided to jump to try and catch a ball. Also, I'm not great at, I can't catch anything. Missed it, ended up tackling another guy, and then landed on my ankle with him sideways on there, and like pretty much busted my foot, okay? My ankle essentially was shattered, but in my mind, I was like, you know what, I can do this. Like, I just need to give it some rest. I didn't want to use crutches, and so I continued to work and continued to do my day-to-day for the next 3 to 4 days, and the swelling just eventually got bigger and bigger, okay? And I don't know if you've ever used crutches, but they're not comfortable. And so I was doing everything I could not to lean on a crutch, not to have the crutches, but eventually I kind of needed to get on them. But even at that point, the crutch was only semi-effective because I didn't lean on it completely. I only leaned on it some. I would still try to put pressure on my foot because I thought maybe if I can just build enough muscle around it, it'll support the bone. And again, that's not how that works. And eventually I ended up having to get surgery and, driving around on one of those like weird little like scooter things. I don't know how else you'd call them, but they look like scooters, where I had to like entirely lean on that thing. And often when we talk about the scriptures, when we're looking into the scriptures, we start seeing God's deliverance, and it was really popular a while ago that we shouldn't use God as a crutch, or that Christianity is a crutch for you, for your own issues, for your own troubles, for your own whatever it might be. And this is a pretty popular thing that people would try to use, so like why they weren't Christians was because, well, I don't need a crutch in my life. But the reality is that we develop crutches all the time. We develop something that we lean on heavily, that we look for deliverance, and that we ultimately place our hope in. Whether that's our finances, whether that's our job, our career, our reputation, it could be a family member, it could be friends, it could be a community. But when we begin to lean on that thing heavily, that whenever we're having a hard time, that's what we need. That's what we need to go to. Whenever there's troubles, that's the first thing we go to, is the sign of where our crutches may be. In our chapters today, what we're going to see is how God begins to remove the crutches out of David's life that he had, that are generally, there's about 5 that we will lean on ourselves, that we see in the life of David. And when those crutches are gone, what it means when Christians say that you have to fully depend on God. Because that's one of the Christianese that we'll throw around of like, hey, do you just have your trust in God? Have you leaned enough on God? Well, what does that mean? What does that actually look like? For a recap, we've been covering through 1 Samuel chapter 18, 19, 20, 21 is where we've been going through slowly, looking at the relationships and the community in David's life. But what we're noticing is more and more that every time these community and these individuals come alongside with him, they're trying to help him against this man named Saul. Saul was the king of Israel at that time, and he became very, very jealous. And in fact, that's where we see Saul's hatred for David, and it was marked by these 2 things, that it was first by jealousy, prompted by his insecurity. If you remember, as David had slain Goliath, and these songs started to be sung, that Saul has slain his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. And then the second thing marked in the hatred that Saul has for David is that there's a fear of God. And that fear of God, and that God was with David, made Saul even more afraid. Because at this point, the Spirit of God has departed from Saul. And instead, these evil spirits are coming upon Saul instead. In chapter 18, we see that Saul throws his first spear when the evil spirit comes upon him. The evil spirits, there's a whole bunch of different things you can think about, but the reality is that God has a council and a people well, not people, but he has a council of spiritual beings that he uses. And one of these evil spirits was released and able to take over Saul. And it's interesting, just as the Holy Spirit used to take over Saul's life, now these evil spirits are quickly becoming on Saul's life. In chapter 19, we see Saul begin to plot with Jonathan and his council, and Jonathan intercedes and returns and gets David trying to get behind the point. That already at this point, several spears have been thrown at David. And so David now is beginning to be pushed out of his position. David was a general at this point. David had been rising in the ranks, and the first crutch that was removed from David is his position of power, his position of authority that he had in these areas. In chapter 19, verse 8, the evil spirit comes on Saul again for a third time. And this is where David's wife saves him. And David's wife lets him out of the window. He retreats. But now his wife has abandoned him and no longer wants anything to do with him at this point. And she is given to another woman, or she is given to another man. And this is the second crutch, his family. His family, those that he would lean onto, and specifically his wife. And we did a passage on this a couple weeks ago, specifically talking about the relationship between a husband and wife and how to support each other and what that looks like. And then in chapter 19, verse 18, David's fled, he's on his own, and he comes and he runs to Samuel. Samuel was his spiritual mentor. Samuel was his leader at that time. And it's a very interesting chapter because basically he runs to Samuel. He says, hey, Saul's trying to kill me. And so Samuel takes him and they hide. But eventually Saul's spies find out where he's at. When they find out where he's at, they tell Saul, and Saul sends a group of soldiers. And these group of soldiers, as soon as they come into the city, all of a sudden, the Spirit comes upon them, and they start acting crazy. They're prophesying, and they get naked. And people are like, well, that's a little weird. So Saul says that's a fluke. He sends another group. Same thing. Another group. Same thing. So Saul says, well, you know what? I'm going to go do it myself. And he goes down there, and sure enough, he starts prophesying and gets naked as well. And it's a very odd chapter that you kind of read, but what we're seeing is that the way Saul was anointed, if you look back several chapters, he went into the same city, and the Spirit came upon him, and he started prophesying in a good way. And he was clothed in righteousness. He was clothed and set up as the king. But now you see Saul going in a different route, where it's all being taken away from him. It's a huge reversal that we see, where he goes into the same city, and now he's prophesying. But the prophesying used in this term is a little bit different than the normal way that we think of prophesying, where we're foretelling the knowledge of God. In this section, this prophecy is speaking more of a loss of control. And that's what happened to the knights, and that's what happened, well, not to the knights, whatever they were, the soldiers. And so he loses control at this point. And a saying is said to him is like, is Saul not also among the prophets? But now it's used in a mockery term. And so you see his kingdom slowly getting stripped away from him. He becomes a parody of himself. So eventually, as all of this is happening, David leaves, and he has to leave. And so the crutch of his spiritual mentor and leader is taken from him. And we're not told specifically why David left. It seemed like there was protection, but it would have only been a matter of time before Saul would have continuously chased after David in this city. And so now he's ostracized from his family, from his spiritual mentor. And then in chapter 20, we see he loses his fourth crutch, which is his friends. His closest friend, Jonathan. And Nate, a couple weeks ago, did a whole series on the relationship with Jonathan and David. And in here, Saul again tries to trap David. Jonathan intercedes, tries to help, but at this point he can't. And so they create this little, it's a little spy type of thing where he's hiding in the grass and he's communicating to David without him really kind of knowing. But they meet each other, and Jonathan gives David his robe, which is a sign of handing over David the kingdom that would have been rightfully his. And it's interesting, the reason why Saul, and when you read about Saul losing his first kingdom, he grabbed at Samuel's cloak and it ripped. And Samuel gives this saying like, hey, just as you tried to rip the cloak, your kingdom is going to be ripped from you as well. And he's trying to do everything he can to try and hold on to his power. And even his own son then is saying, no, David, you're supposed to be the rightful king. And these crutches are slowly being taken from David. People that he'd lean on, relationships that he'd have. And whenever we're going through these darker seasons, whenever we're noticing that, we're going through a hard time, we're hitting the wall in our spiritual journey, we have to be aware of where we're going, have to be aware of our own crutches, and seeking God for guidance. Because in 1 Samuel chapter 21, we read a very interesting story with David, with the priests. In verse 1, it says, Then David came to Nob, to Amalekite, the priest. And Amalekite came and met David, trembling, and said to him, Why are you alone, and no one is with you? Rumors gotten out, obviously at this point already, about David, and he sees David coming to this temple here, and the priest is afraid. He's like, why are you here, David? What is happening? And David gives this very odd explanation. And David said to Amalekite the priest, The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, Let no one know anything about the matter by which I am sending you, in which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with you and the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here. And the priest answered David, I have no common bread on hand, but there is the holy bread. And if the young men have kept themselves from women. And David answered the priest, Truly, women have been kept from us, as always, and I go out on the expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today are their vessels to be holy? So the priest gave him the holy bread, and there was no bread there but the bread of the presence. Down into verse 7, Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. And David said to Amalekite, Then do you not have a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business requires haste. And the priest said, The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah. Behold, it is here wrapped in cloth behind the ephod. And if you will take it, for there is none other but this one. And David said, There is none like that. Give that to me. So he goes to the priest. He's like, hey, I'm on a super secret mission, all right? I can't tell you anything about it. That's why I'm here. And the priest is already a little bit hesitant about this story. And David is most likely telling him this story to try and protect the priest, to try and protect the priesthood that was there, but he's asking for food. And the priest is like, well, David, you know the only thing we have is this bread. And this bread was set apart. This bread was only supposed to be for the priests, but he makes an exception for it because of who David was. This is where we talk about how David was also an illustration of the priesthood, how he was the not only king, but also to help with the priests. And he receives this bread, and then he says, hey, you got any swords? And again, the priest is like, we don't have swords, David. But he gives him Goliath's sword, this big, massive sword. And then David goes on his way. But there's this guy, Doge, who's an Edomite, and he's observing all this. He sees David getting rations, he sees David getting these things. And it's in these actions that David took, whether he was trying to do this intentionally or whether he was just trying to cover his back, the idea of him saving the priests didn't help. Because in a few chapters, Doge goes to Saul and says, hey, I found out where David is. And he goes to the priests, and the priests say what David said, of like, oh, I thought you were sending him on a super secret mission. And Saul loses it, tries to get all of his soldiers to kill the priests, and all the soldiers are like, we're not going to kill him. And so instead, he has the Edomite kill them. And all these people have lost their lives at this point. Now David is going to not only be feeling isolated, but he's also at this point where he's feeling a lot of guilt. He's feeling the haste in this moment. In Psalm 52, this is what David writes in this moment. Why do you boast of evil, O mighty man? The steadfast love of God endures all the day. Like the tongues plotting destruction, like a sharp razor, you workers of deceit. You love evil more than good, and lying more than speaking what is right. You love all the words that devour, O deceitful tongue. But God will break you down forever. He will snatch and tear you from the tent. He will uproot you from the land of the living. The righteous shall see and fear, and shall laugh at him, saying, see, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches, and sought refuge in his own destruction. David writes this after he had heard what had happened to the priest, and the one priest that was alive, he had joined his military with him. But the guilt and the frustration you can read of David writing specifically to Doge, this coward, where he says, you boast of evil, O mighty man, in a mocking term. And he cries out to God for God to be his vengeance, for God to see this, that God is not going to let this go. You see a man that would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and sought refuge in his own destruction. In 2 Samuel chapter 22, after this time with the priests, in verse 10, and David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servant of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David has struck down his tens of thousands. And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the door and the gates, and let spit run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see this man is mad. Why have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? Continuing on into the next chapter, David then departed and escaped to the caves of Adullam. And when his brothers and all of his father's household heard this, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became the commander over them. And there were about 400 men with him. So David flees from one situation into this next, into Gath. And this is where Goliath was from. We don't really know why David chose to kind of do this. Maybe he thought that he'd be a hired merc, which he eventually is for the Philistines. But the killing of their greatest warrior was still pretty fresh. And notice how they're considering David. They're saying, hey, this is David, king of the land, not Saul. The outsiders saw David as king already. And then they know the song, that this is David who's killed tens of thousands of us. So it doesn't go very well as he enters into that land. And they capture him. And he has to give up his last and final crutch, where David loses his self-respect, his dignity. David has his whole weaknesses exposed, and he has nothing left at this point. Now he has to depend on God's grace to be magnified in his life fully. Now it might seem weird that self-respect and dignity might be a crutch, but that's our own self-righteousness. That's in our own ability. I would never stoop that low. I would never ask for help. I would never go out for food stamps. I would never, whatever it might be, but you have too much pride, too much dignity to see where God's deliverance is at. Where God is providing an open door. Where God is trying to show you something that you should do. But your pride in who you are and the life that you've built up is too great. There's 3 warnings that we learn about crutches in this life of David here. First, that crutches ultimately and obviously become a substitute for God. We need to lean on God only, first and foremost. When we lean on these other crutches, it's why so many sometimes don't feel like there's a need for him. There's not a need to hear from God. There's not a need to depend on him because I can always go to my job. I can always go to my friends. I can always go to the life that I've built up, and I'll find something better. As long as we lean on something other than Christ, we won't lean on him. It's a pattern that we've been brought up with where kids will generally lean on their parents, teachers, peers. We're eventually taught that we lean on our future hope as we go into college. This starts to get us through. We lean on our spouse to help us out, to be our support when things are going hard. Our job, for our financial security, that bank account savings that we have, that if everything else goes wrong, at least I have this. We'll lean on education, that I can learn my way out of this. When I'm going through the hardships and the spiritual journey, I could just learn more things. And this can happen just internally when we're trying to where is God? God, I can't hear you. Where are you? You know what? I'll just learn more about you, God. I'll just sit back and I'll pick up more books. I'll listen to more sermons. And we make our education, our ability to learn, a crutch for us. And all these things are good. All of these things are good things for us that God has given, that God wants us to use, but they cannot be the first thing that we lean on, the primary thing that when you start feeling that anxiety, when you start feeling everything start to close in, you think back, at least I have this. Because crutches keep our focus horizontal instead of vertical with God. We look to the relationship, we look at the situation, to those friends, but we don't really look to God for help. What is God having us in this moment? Why am I going through this? What is God trying to teach me? What in myself don't I understand that God is trying to draw up to show when the Psalms speak, God, search me, search my soul. And we have to let God show us that. But instead, we go to everything else. Because we're trying to find a way out of the situation instead of letting God walk us through and be with us in it. This is paralyzed Christian growth, where we lean on everything else. And for so many, even when they're going through hardships spiritually, they'll lean on the church, but then the church wasn't there for them in this. Or there wasn't a community that I felt like I could have called home in this one spot. Or these people, they weren't there for me in this situation. And we have these pseudo relationships that we've kind of created that aren't genuine because we're putting an expectation on them they could never fulfill. We're all still human. We're all still going to make mistakes. The only one that's going to provide for you in these situations is going to be God. Because crutches just give temporary relief. See, we run to all these other things because we want to tranquilize the experience. We don't want to feel and go through the storm anymore. We don't want to go through these hardships anymore. But we should accept what God is trying to do with us in this moment. And instead of trying to numb it, instead of trying to escape it, instead of trying to get out of it, to hear what God is trying to tell you and I in these things. We don't need temporary relief. We just need to lean on God in these moments, to trust Him and see what is He trying to work in this moment through you and in you. Through you, how you can bless other people. Through you, how you are a light to other people, that people see you. And in you, that you can see within yourself what God is developing, what God is putting together, that God is drawing something out of you. Whether that's a purpose maybe you never thought you had, maybe that's a calling you never thought about, maybe it is removing something that you've held on to forever. But He's drawing something out in these situations. When we fall back on these crutches regularly, we build up a habit instead of trusting on the Lord. And the problems, they will become more intense. When every crutch is stripped, it means that we are turning to God and we have to learn how to say, God is enough. Because sooner or later, every one of us will spend time in the caves. Every one of us will have to retreat in that area. And it's painful to have some of your crutches removed. And some of us are feeling and witnessing that's happening to us. Death of a dream, a marriage that's on the brinks, a relationship that's falling apart, new phases of life that we know nothing about. And it's in these cave moments that David wrote Psalm 56 and Psalm 34. And it's in here we can learn how to be encouraged by God and how to actually lean on Him fully. In Psalm 56, what we read is, "Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long, attackers oppress me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly when I'm afraid. And when I am afraid, I put my trust in you, in God, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my causes. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife and they lurk. They watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crimes will they escape? In the wrath of God, he cast down the people of God. You have kept count of my tossings, of my tears in the bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will return back, and the day I will call. This I know, that God is for me. In God, those words I praise, and the Lord, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God, and render thanks and offerings to you, for you have delivered my soul from death. Yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. And Psalm 34 follows a very similar message, but you see it coming in a more positive light as well. That he's praising God in a very odd time, in a time where he's alone, in a time where he's lost everything. But he's remembering God's deliverance. Leaning on God means we have to do a few things. Number one, we have to discuss our discouragement openly with God. We have to be willing to talk to God openly. Notice David going back and forth in the struggles in this, where he's like, God, they're coming to get me. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I trust you. I trust you, God. God, these men, they're lying awake. I'm crying every night. I'm anxious all the time, but I trust in you, God. I trust in you. And he repeats this pattern as he's having to remind himself of what he's going through. You and I will sometimes silence our own voices, our own crying out to God, because we feel like we shouldn't talk to God about how bad the situation is. Because there's things that are worse. Because this isn't that big of a deal. But we see in the pattern, and when we went through lament, this is him crying out again in that moment and wrestling through these things. When we wrestle and we're open with God, we discover our ultimate refuge for him as our deliverance. And it means you and I are getting so immersed in God's presence, so convinced of his goodness, so devout to his lordship, that even in the darkest places where we're so isolated, that God is with us. We resist the shortcuts. We think about what happened with David last week, where there was an easy shortcut, but leaning on our crutches all lead to shortcuts for us. And then there's times when we're leaning on God where there is humble action for you and I to take as well. Sometimes when we think of God as our deliverance, as someone that's going to help us, God, help me. God, I need you. Deliver me. Sometimes we're waiting for some outside force. But remember how deliverance came to David. The deliverance from God came to David by him drooling. Not a way we'd normally think about deliverance coming to us. God's deliverance can take a strange form and maybe not what we necessarily expect. Neil Warren, he talks about some of these ideas and the idea of hope, where we need hope in a situation. And he talks about how, honestly, most marriages fail because of a lack of hope. They fail because they're expecting some outside thing to happen for them, some miracle. If we go to this retreat, if we do this one thing, and he says, instead, you can give yourself hope by just improving 10% in one area. All right, I get angry too fast. I'm going to improve in that by 10%. You can give hope in a situation by just improving a little bit in one area. And sometimes that's God's deliverance. Sometimes you feeling humiliated and coming before your boss and saying, you know what, I was wrong, I did this, these things are a mess, I need to take ownership for it. But it saves your job. Sometimes it's you waiting and feeling alone and wondering, God, what are we going to do? And you look around in the community that God has you in this moment and see the deliverance through people you would have never imagined. See, when David went to the caves, many people came alongside with him. But notice who those people were. They weren't the people he was used to. They weren't fellow soldiers necessarily. They weren't people up in Saul's area. Instead, they were people who were distressed, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in the soul, and they gathered to him, and he became commander over them. See, David was now on the margins of society, an outcast. But David wasn't left alone. David felt alone. He felt isolated. All of the crutches, all of the things that he had built his life on before were stripped from him. And as he cried out to God and wrote these Psalms, God brings him a new community, new friends to come alongside that he wouldn't have normally hung out with. He was still in a cave, but his perspective changed with others who were like-minded, with others who were in a similar situation. And it's interesting, in this community, there's two specific people that come alongside. Gad, the prophet, and Abiathar, the priest. So now you have the prophet, the priest, and the king there with the rejected and the margins of society. They were opposed by the known world at that time in Israel, and they were only being sought after by the outcasts, the rejects. This is what Jesus' ministry was. Jesus' ministry was set in the same way, where those who were great, those who were smart, those who had the religious upbringing rejected Christ. And instead it was the marginalized. Instead it was those who were outcast in that society. And that's why 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 through 27 says, not many of you were called who were wise. Not many of you who were called had strength. And he's reminding them of who God reaches out to. That God uses every one of us, no matter where we're feeling in this phase of life, if we feel like we're nobody, if we feel like we're not having any part in a normal community, if we feel alone, or we just don't feel like we had the right upbringing, if we just don't feel like things are going the way that everyone told us should as Americans, that we should be able to own this house, that we should be able to have this type of job, that if I got this degree, these things should happen, that we don't fit the picture of what most people are trying to build out for their American lives, that God sees you and that God has that purpose. And those were the people that God used specifically. That through our weaknesses, God's grace will work to undermine the pride of the world. When David had everything stripped from him, there's no reason he should have lived. But when David humbled himself and saw all of his weaknesses before God, God built him up into what we're seeing the next phases of David as this mighty warrior in this guerrilla warfare. Let's pray. God, I pray as we go into table talks, Lord, that you would speak to us, that we'd wrestle through some of these things. Lord, that there's a lot that we can kind of see of a picture of you and the work that you did inside of David's life as the priestly king. And God, the hope that you can bring us and what it looks like to depend on you alone, God. Lord, I thank you for your grace. that it overflows anything that we can ever do, because God, without it, we're a mess. So we pray this in your name. Amen.